In the autumn of 1941, the world held its breath. The German war machine, the most terrifying military force ever assembled, stood at the very gates of Moscow. Victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. And yet, 6 months later, that same army lay shattered, frozen into the endless Russian snow, beginning a retreat that would end in the ruins of Berlin. This wasn't just a lost battle. It was the catastrophic failure of the largest invasion in human history. It was the moment the myth of German invincibility died. But why? How did an operation that began with such stunning success and came so agonizingly close to victory collapse into one of the greatest military disasters of all time? The answer is not just one of mud or snow. It is a story of flawed ideology, fatal arrogance, and a series of critical miscalculations that doomed Operation Barbarossa from the moment it was conceived. The plan, born in July 1940, even before the Battle of Britain was decided, was the ultimate expression of Adolf Hitler's ideology. His concept of Lebensraum, or living space, demanded the conquest of Eastern Europe to create a vast, resource-rich empire. Having crushed France in a mere 6 weeks, German confidence was absolute. Hitler held a deep-seated racist contempt for the Soviet people and their communist system. He famously declared, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come crumbling down." This was not just bravado, it was the central, fatal assumption upon which the entire invasion was built. The Germans were not just planning on a short war, they fundamentally needed one. They lacked the reserves of oil, rubber, men, and material for a prolonged conflict. The blitzkrieg had to knock the Soviet Union out of the war in 6 to 8 weeks, or the entire campaign would be at risk. To achieve this, Germany mustered over 3 million men, a river of steel and humanity that poured across the border on June 22, 1941. The initial success was breathtaking. The Luftwaffe annihilated the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the first 48 hours, giving the Wehrmacht total freedom of movement. The Panzer divisions, using the same blitzkrieg tactics that had shattered Europe, tore through the unprepared Soviet lines. The Red Army, caught by surprise and led by an officer corps that had been terrorized and decimated by Stalin's purges, was tragically slow to react. Where British and French commanders would have retreated, the poorly led Soviet armies were ordered to stand and fight, allowing them to be encircled and annihilated in a series of colossal battles. But almost immediately, the first German miscalculation revealed itself. The German high command believed the entire Soviet army numbered around 3 million men. They were catastrophically wrong. By Christmas of 1941, German armies had already killed or captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, and yet new armies continued to appear before them. They had kicked in the door, but the house was infinitely larger and more resilient than they had ever imagined. This miscalculation was compounded by a second, equally fatal error: logistics. The sheer, mind-numbing vastness of the Soviet Union began to swallow the German army whole. The railway gauges were different, forcing all supplies to be laboriously unloaded and reloaded at the border. The roads, where they existed at all, were unpaved tracks that were an engineer's nightmare. The German supply lines, stretched over hundreds of miles of hostile territory and harassed by partisans, began to fray and break. This led to the third fatal flaw: a fundamental disagreement on strategy. The generals obsessed with the blitzkrieg model insisted on a single decisive thrust to Moscow to decapitate the regime. But Hitler, driven by his economic and ideological goals, ordered a diversion. He peeled off the panzer groups of Army Group Center, sending them south to secure the resources of Ukraine, and north to assist with Leningrad. While this led to another massive victory at Kyiv, it was a Pyrrhic one. The 2-month pause before Moscow was a gift the Soviets could not have prayed for. It gave them a vital breather to establish a new defensive line, to bring up fresh reserves, and for the Russian weather to turn. And the weather did turn. First came General Mud. The autumn Rasputitsa turned the landscape into a swamp, immobilizing the German panzers and supply trucks. The blitzkrieg, a strategy defined by speed, literally sank into the earth. Then, as the mud froze into a treacherous iron-hard landscape, came General Winter. Temperatures plunged to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The German army, still in summer uniforms, began to freeze to death. Weapons seized up. More German soldiers were hospitalized for frostbite than for combat wounds. The Germans now faced a fourth horrifying reality they had refused to plan for: the resilience of the Soviet people. Fueled by Stalin's desperate patriotism and the indescribable brutality of the German occupation, the Soviet will to fight did not break. The German policy of starving prisoners and slaughtering civilians backfired, turning a potential war of liberation into the Great Patriotic War, a fight for national survival. It was in these conditions that the Germans made their final, exhausted lunge for Moscow. They were stopped by fresh, fully equipped Siberian divisions, troops the Germans never even knew existed. These soldiers, trained for winter warfare, slammed into the freezing German lines. The hunters had become the hunted. On December 6th, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive that caught the Germans completely by surprise and sent them reeling backwards. Barbarossa was over. Hitler's ideological assumption had shattered against the wall of reality. Germany needed a quick victory, but the Soviets, through sheer resilience, unimaginable sacrifice, and a timely intervention by their two greatest generals, Mudd and Winter, had dragged them into the one thing they could not win, a long, grinding war of attrition. They were now stuck deep inside a hostile country, at the end of a broken supply line, facing an enemy that could seemingly generate endless reserves of manpower. Though the war was far from over, the turning point had been reached. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was not a single event, but a cascade of failures. Failures of intelligence, of logistics, of strategy, and ultimately of ideology. It was a catastrophe from which the Third Reich would never recover. The failure of Operation Barbarossa offers a series of chilling and timeless lessons about the nature of warfare. It stands as a testament that ideology, no matter how fanatically believed, is no defense against the brutal realities of logistics and geography. The Germans planned a war based on their own self-image of superiority and their contempt for the enemy, failing to account for the enemy's will to survive. They confused a nation's government with its people, and in their brutal attempt to destroy one, they inadvertently forged the other into an unbreakable weapon of resistance. The vast plains and unforgiving seasons of the East became not just a battlefield, but active participants in the conflict, swallowing armies and exposing the fatal arrogance of a plan built on hubris. Ultimately, Barbarossa teaches us that wars are rarely won by a single, brilliant kick in the door. They are won by the side that can endure the most suffering, replace its losses, and adapt when its initial plan shatters against the wall of the unexpected. Germany's inability to do this in the face of Soviet resilience defined the turning point of the Second World War. It was a failure of planning, a failure of understanding, and a failure of imagination from which there would be no recovery. These lessons from the past are crucial to understanding our present. If you believe these deep dives into military history are important and you want to ensure you don't miss our next investigation, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Your support is what allows us to continue telling these vital stories.